Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon everyone who's listening. My name is Kenny Bomer. I'm the author of the book Consider Islam, Disproving the Patriots of Propaganda. And I'd like to welcome you to my podcast, Consider Islam, Truth Has Been Made Clear from Falsehood. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a recording from a discussion that I had on an internet radio program by the name of Radio Free Kafiristan on Patriot Radio. And the host of this program is a gentleman by the name of Eric. He calls himself Eric the Kafir Smith. And it says that he's in Kafiristan. And on that program, they have a few different segments, but one of their segments is titled The Cross and the Crescent. And the discussion on that day was, is God just or unjust based on the Bible? Is the God in the Bible just or unjust? And so I called in to discuss this issue with these guys. If you're unfamiliar with this program, Radio Free Kafiristan on Patriot Radio, I encourage you to just listen to one of their programs, and it won't take long to see that they are absolute Islamophobes. They hate Islam, they ridicule Islam, they mock Islam continuously, and so I just called in to just have a discussion about the Bible. So I'm going to get right into it and let you listen, and so I encourage you to please donate to my podcast. It helps me to continue my dawah efforts and sharing the truth of the beauty of Islam, and to help me with the publishing and all those things of the books and all the costs that are involved. So please donate if you can. Any small amount will do, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our God, our Creator, reward you for giving for that effort for dawah. So I'm going to get right into the program. Thank you for listening.
Much sense. Hey, hello Kenny, how are you doing today?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing great. Doing great. How are you guys doing?
We're doing wonderful.
Great. It's good to hear.
So did you hear about the topic that we're speaking about this evening? This afternoon?
About God being just in the Bible, just or unjust in the Bible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
I haven't heard any of the conversation thus far, because I was moderating another debate, and but yeah, I'm glad to be here.
No problem. So I gave roughly about a 5 to 6 minutes a little presentation on the necessity of a blood sacrifice. I went to different places in the Old Testament, to Leviticus, Exodus, and different places to show the necessity of a blood sacrifice. Also correlated that with the Second Temple Judaism that did blood sacrifice for the remission of sins and whatnot. And correlated that with the New Testament and how Jesus is the one that shed his blood for the sins of mankind.
Okay. So it sounds like you're talking more about salvation than you are the actual topic.
Well, for God to be a just God, though, I believe that a sin needs to have a payment. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And if you allow me to give my position on this topic.
You know what? I give you like 5 minutes if you'd like, Kenny.
Sure. Well, I would like to go to the Old Testament as well and discuss a number of passages there. I'm only going to mention about 5 in particular, but there are many verses in the Old Testament primarily that point to a God that would be unjust. And of course, as a Muslim, I don't believe that to be the case. And as a Muslim, I believe that there are things in the Bible that are correct, and there are things in the Bible that just don't seem logical. And so I certainly don't believe as a Muslim that our God is unjust. I believe He's totally just. And but I do want to point out these particular scriptures from the Old Testament that actually signify otherwise based on what the Bible states. In Deuteronomy, the 2nd chapter, verses 30 through 34, all the king's sons and the town, all the men in the town, and all the women and all the children were killed. And that's not a just God wouldn't kill women and children and all of the men, especially the children that aren't responsible for the acts of anyone else. In Joshua, the 7th chapter, verses 4 10, 11, 15, 19 through 16, we see that God refuses the repentance of Ashan, and therefore, after refusing his repentance, he kills all of his sons and all of his daughters and all the animals that were there. And that's not something that a just God would do. In Judges chapter 8, verse 15 through 17, we see that the God punishes all the old people for not giving bread to Gideon and his men, and so they were punished and tortured by being placed into the thorns, into the briars. And God also in those verses pulls down the Tower of Peniel, killing all the men of the town because of some bread. And that's not, to me, a God that would be just. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 18 through 19, we see that Saul wasn't able to kill all the Amalekites, and because he wasn't able to kill all the Amalekites, God decides that he's going to kill all the Israelites instead. So that's not something that a just God would do. Also in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, we see that Uzzah was killed for trying to keep the Ark of the Covenant from falling after God had directed people not to touch it. But he was simply trying to keep it from falling. So, these are just 5 examples. There's actually many, many, many more that point to a God that would be unjust. And this points to why the Marcionites actually, they actually believed in 2 different gods. They believed in the God of the Old Testament. They believed in the God of the New Testament. They believed that the God of the Old Testament was unjust, and that the God of the New Testament was more forgiving, and he was more, more just. And so we see signs of modern Marcionism today in Christianity, where we have people that are Christians that reject the Old Testament. They only rely upon the New Testament. Matter of fact, I have a little handheld New Testament that's right behind me on my desk back there. So, the Old Testament is completely taken away, and people are only focusing on the New Testament, trying to differentiate, saying that the God of the Old Testament was unjust and the God of the New Testament is just. As a matter of fact, in regards to that, there was a book on modern Marcionism that was written by a man by the name of Wesley Hill, and he quotes a man by the name of Andy Stanley, and he says, and I quote, it says, "Here's what the Jerusalem Council was saying to the Gentiles. They were saying, you're not accountable to the 10 Commandments." And he went on to say, Christians must unhitch the Old Testament from their faith. And so I wanted to make that point regarding, primarily these verses about God being unjust come in the Old Testament. You find many, many of them in there in the Old Testament. And there's also some there that would equate to God being just. But there's so many that equate to him being unjust, such as the ones that I just mentioned. Killing everyone over some bread and not being given to some soldiers that's not something that any person with any decency would do. Kill masses of people over a loaf of bread or some bread that wasn't given to someone. These are just things that are not equated to someone being just. And by no means, once again, as a Muslim, I'm not saying that I believe that our Creator is unjust. By no means do I mean that. But based on the topic, I can't avoid these particular scriptures that I know that I know they exist, and I know that these are signs that pointing that God is unjust. So there's a matter of fact, if you go to
I'm going to stop that real quick.
Sure, go ahead.
Can I just interject real quick? Kenny, I noticed you said a couple times, God would not do that because God is not unjust. So you decide what is just for God and what is not just?
I don't decide that, and no human being can decide that. But the verses in the Bible are clear cut.
You said that. You said that a number of times. No. You said, you judged the verses in the Bible. You said very clearly, God would not do that. So what do you base it on that God?
I think you get cut off there, I think. But no, I'm not saying what God will do and what God would not do. But from a logical perspective, if you believe that that God would kill people over a loaf of bread, people not being given a loaf of bread, you're welcome to believe that. I personally don't believe that. I don't think that's a just thing to do, and I don't think that it's just to kill women and children that had nothing to do with the circumstances, such as in the case in Deuteronomy, the 2nd chapter, verses 30 through 34. Women and children had nothing to do with what was taking place there, and I personally don't believe that God, being that He's just, I don't believe that He would do such a thing. That's my personal opinion. If you want to believe otherwise, you're welcome to believe whatever you'd like to believe. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Kenny. Jay, I do see that you have your hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself there, Jay.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jay. Go ahead.
All right, great. Hey, Kenny, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
So you brought up a number of verses in the Bible, and I think it'd be useful if we went over each one individually. But sure. I kind of, on the same kind of token, out of what Brad just asked, let me just give you an example. There was a tribe, the Sowi people in New Guinea in the 1960s, and up until the 1960s, they were still cannibals. They were headhunters, and their morality would have been very different than yours or mine. For them, it was a moral thing to deceive people. It was a moral thing to betray somebody and even cut off their heads, whatever. So where do you get this idea that we can just kind of step back and be neutral and judge what's moral, what's immoral? When you look at, you look around the world and you look at different tribes, and you see that their morality is very different than, say, in the West. Where do you kind of say, okay, this is just and this is unjust? What's the line that you're drawing from?
Well, I think you're a bit off topic there regarding what you've mentioned, because we're not talking about what people do, and people are going to be unjust. There's no question about that. People do all kinds of different things that's unjust. But the topic from my understanding, is the God of the Bible just, or is He unjust?
Okay, so the question is about your foundations for why you're making the judgments. You're saying that something that God does is unjust. The idea that I'm getting at is that our perception of morality, what you consider to be just and unjust, isn't what a tribe in the Amazon considers to be just and unjust. So how do you determine what is good and what's not good if you're not going to, appeal to God?
Well, I think that if you consider, whether or not, just by example, back to the bread, if you believe that it's okay for a group of people or an individual to have masses of people killed or multiple people killed because one group of people wasn't given a loaf of bread, I don't think you would argue that point. I don't think you would believe that would be, those people would be just, or those people would be doing right if they were to kill one group of people because another group of people didn't receive some bread. And because I believe as a Muslim that our God is the most just, He's the most merciful, the most gracious, the most compassionate. I don't believe personally that a just God would kill people that over a loaf of bread that they had nothing to do with. So if you understand what's taking place in that verse, one group of people is being slaughtered because another group of people weren't given.
Okay, so your standard for justice and what's right comes from your understanding of Islam. You're not taking an atheist perspective. You're taking an Islamic perception of God. And since you said God in Islam is all just, all righteous, that's your standard for what's right and what's wrong. Now, when it comes to one of the verses you mentioned children being killed. Do you believe that God can kill children and still be just?
Yeah, absolutely. But children are dying every day. My son, 26-year-old, he passed away in June, and I believe that's by the way.
I'm sorry to hear that.
I appreciate it. Alhamdulillah. Even though my son passed away, I believe that our God is just. I believe that everything happens by His will. But that doesn't imply that I believe, children obviously are dying and they're innocent. If they haven't reached the age of accountability, then they're still considered to be innocent. But yet they die, and I do believe that happens by God's will. And I can see where you might, try to apply that to the verses in Deuteronomy that I mentioned. Yeah, but we have to look at all this collectively, and we've got to say, okay, well, that's one instance. Okay, we can say that God does, allow people to suffer sometimes, and children do die, and it's all a test to mankind. As a Muslim, I believe that every one of these circumstances are a test. My son passing away in June is a test to me. What am I going to do? Am I going to be angry with our Creator, or am I going to trust in His will and say, from Allah we come, and to Him we return? He chooses the day that we're born. He chooses the day that we pass away. It's all by His will. So I do certainly believe that children do die by God's will. But we have to look at these verses that I mentioned collectively and say, okay, well, let's, other than the children, a man was killed because he was simply trying to balance the ark and prevent it from falling. And, God killed him in the Bible, based on the Bible. He killed him in the Bible. And, he because Saul wasn't able to kill all the Amalekites, all the Israelites were killed. So we have to look at all these things collectively if we're going to talk about this topic, and not just equate it to one group of people, and narrow it down to just children. And I understand what you're trying to get at as far as these things happen by God's will, but the topic of the discussion is this just? Is God just? And if you feel that it's just for God to kill people over some bread, I'm not trying to implore you to think anything different. I just refuse to believe that.
Now, look, if we looked at it this way, Kenny, if God gives a command, should that command be followed?
Well, absolutely. There's no question about that. And there's consequences. There's consequences for not following His command.
Excellent. So, if someone doesn't follow the command and receives the consequence, what's unjust about that?
Well, what would be unjust is if one person was punished for the actions of another.
So you disagree with, let's say, I got in trouble and you offered to pay for my penalty, like you would go to jail for me in my place and serve my sentence for me. And you would say that would be unjust. I should have to serve my own sentence because I was the one that committed the crime. Is that the way you're looking at it?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's, for instance, also in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 9 through 19, you see that David's, in order to punish David for his wrongdoing, God kills his son. And, once again, the son is innocent, especially an infant son. He's innocent. It's unfathomable to think that our Creator would punish one group of people for the actions of another, or punish, my son for my actions. It's as a Muslim, I believe that on the Day of Judgment, all of our actions and our deeds are going to be placed on scales. The books of deeds are going to be brought out. Everything that we've done and anything that we've ever said, all of our actions are going to be weighed that day. And I'm going to stand alone before my Creator, just like I came into the world alone. I'm going to die alone, and I'm going to stand before my Creator alone. And I believe, my son, when he passed away, I believe it's the same thing is going to apply to him. What he's done wrong in his life has nothing to do with me, other than if I didn't guide him properly, if I, gave him was a negative influence in some way, then I'll be responsible for my actions in that regard, and he'll be responsible for what he acted on. The thing is, there's many verses that are like this in the Bible.
No, and I totally understand where you're coming from, Kenny. That's why I went through the sacrificial system. in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. But you definitely have just admitted, basically, God is unjust, right? If he allows someone to pay for another sin. That's an unjust God in your view, right?
Yeah. I believe that a God that would do that would allow someone else to pay for something that I've done or something that you've done, and some stranger that we don't know, he was to pay the consequence for what we've done. I don't see that as being a just God that would do that. As a Muslim, I refuse to believe that our Creator operates that way. And why do I say that? I say that because we ourselves, being humans and functioning in a manner in which we do wrong consistently, we wouldn't function that way. We wouldn't punish. We just instinctively know that that's unjust. You don't punish one person for something that another person has done. And because our God is above us and he's better than us in every way, then I can't see that he would do something that we ourselves wouldn't do. So
excellent. So you would reject what is said in the 110 Hadith Qudsi, Hadith number 8 there, that states the sins of the Muslims will be taken off of them and placed upon the Jews and the Christians. That you would say that would be an unjust action then, correct?
We're not talking about the Hadith today. We're talking about the Bible.
But what we're talking about is your standard of being just and unjust. And
yeah,
you just...
I want to stick to the topic.
I let you speak, sir.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
You just stated that a God is unjust if he allows another to pay for someone's sin. But in 110 Hadith Qudsi, Hadith number 8, it actually states that Allah would take the sins from the Muslims and place them upon the Jews and the Christians. So therefore, that's an unjust act by your own admission, isn't it?
No, I haven't admitted anything about that. As a matter of fact, I redirected that question back to the topic at hand, which is the Bible. But right now, we're not talking about Hadith. We're talking about whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible. Hadith, as we know, have many. There's authentic Hadith. There's unauthentic Hadith. There's Hadith that have been fabricated.
Are you saying that the 110 Hadith Qudsi, Hadith 8, is not authentic or a weak Hadith? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not talking. What I'm trying to say is that I have no interest in talking about that Hadith at all, because I want to stick to the topic at hand, which is whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible.
Well, I understand that. What we're just trying to do is you were stating that God isn't just for certain reasons. You don't believe that a just God would do these things. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see where your standard would be, what your criterion to judge what is just or unjust. So when I went through the line of the questioning with someone taking the sin upon someone else and paying for that sin, you said that was an unjust God. But yet it shows in your own Hadith that that's what your law does. So by your own admission, that's what you've said, is that's an unjust God. Right?
No, I didn't admit any of that.
Well, we have to know where your standard comes from, and if it's a flawed standard, then how are you able to judge something else when you can't really withstand the criterion or standard? It'd be like your own subjective reasoning at that point, not a objective standard by any means, would it?
Well, once again, you're trying to redirect the topic to the Hadith in Islam, and we're talking about whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible. And so as a Muslim, I've already stated my position regarding this issue, that as a Muslim, based on the verses of the Quran, God does not burden a soul beyond its capacity to bear it. He does not put the burdens of one person's sin on another, other than if, like I've already mentioned, if one person was to influence another person or group of people to do wrong, they're responsible for that influence, but they're not responsible for the acts of those individuals. So, if you understand what I'm stating here, so
you've stated a bunch of times, though, Kenny, that you have to, as a Muslim, you have to follow the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad, not just the Quran, correct?
Right.
And you get those teachings of Muhammad mainly in the Hadith, do you not? Most of the commands from Allah you get in the Quran, but the teachings of Muhammad you get in the Hadith. Is that correct?
Yeah, but the Hadith has nothing to do with the topic at hand. The topic at hand is whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible, and so despite what I believe as a Muslim, the topic still remains whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible.
Well, I know, but we have to agree on a standard to what is just and what is not. Go ahead, Robert.
Hey, Chris, Kenny, can you hear me? Okay, good. I'm going to stop signing a little country subdivision. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it'd be better if you took that thing off, but we can hear you good.
Hello?
Yep.
No, that's a microphone, man. It's like up here. Okay. Well, I just want to point out that Kenny, his standard seems to be what he believes. He has said numerous times and in numerous ways, I don't believe God would do that. I don't believe it's just for God to do it. I don't believe this. I don't believe that. So, Kenny, what Chris is trying to do, he's trying to use your standard, what should be your standard, which is the Hadith and the Quran and the Sunnah, etc., okay, to set up your standard. Because you seem to be saying that, well, you are deciding what is just and unjust for God to do. Okay, we as Christians are saying God decides what is just and unjust to do. And when God says, well, he's going to put people for bread or whatever, well, there's a reason for that, and it is just. We do not sit there and say, well, you are unjust for doing that, oh Lord. Absolutely not. As a matter of fact, if you said that to God, you...
Oh, I think he cut off again. Do you understand any of that, Kenny? Or?
I have no clue what he said.
So basically what he was saying there is you kept saying that I believe this as a Muslim, I believe that as a Muslim. So it's giving us the impression that you're using the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah as your standard to determine what is just and unjust. Isn't that correct, though?
Well, that's my personal beliefs have nothing to do with the topic at hand. What we're talking about today is whether or not God is just or unjust in the Bible. So
would you agree that we have to determine a standard to what is just and unjust?
Sure, absolutely. But if you notice what I've stated 2 or 3 times already, I've stated that if others believe that God is being just for killing people over a loaf of bread, then you're welcome to believe that. But as a Muslim, I don't believe that. So, I'm not trying to convince you to believe what I believe. If you can believe whatever you like to believe. But I prefer to stay on the topic at hand instead of trying to make this an attack on Islam as usual. So,
a couple things.
And I'm not here, if you understand, if you notice my approach to this, that I'm not here to criticize the Bible. I'm not saying one way or another, other than as a Muslim, I don't believe that God is unjust. But I have to point out these verses of the Bible that do seem to be a bit unjust. And if you can, we can go, like the brother said, we can go through and talk about each of these verses one at a time. And everyone's welcome to think what they wish. But you'll see that these verses that I'm going to point out will indeed, indicate that it seems to be a God that was unjust, which is why the Messianites that I had mentioned believed that the God of the Old Testament was unjust and the God of the New Testament was just and forgiving. So these are Messianites. These are 2nd century, followers of Jesus. So, this is not something that I'm inventing as a Muslim. This is not something that I'm utilizing, trying to put my Islamic standard on it. This is something that these verses speak for themselves, which is why the early Christians debated with one another. And we have Christians even nowadays that follow modern Marcionism, which is, you can read the writings by Wesley Hill on that matter, that point to the people that say They want to reject the Old Testament, say we live under a new covenant. We want to get rid of that old way of doing things. And why do they say that? They say that because things in the Old Testament seem to be unjust. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. My name is Kenny Bomer. I'm the author of the book Consider Islam Disproving the Patriots of Propaganda, and I want to tell you about my new podcast on the platform Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, and it's absolutely free. There are many creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone, and Anchor will actually distribute your podcast for you on other platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you could also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. So they have everything that you need right there to make your podcast all in one place. And once again, it's Anchor. You can. I encourage you to download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started, just like I have. And I encourage you to please sponsor me and any amount that you can give for my podcast. I'm going to be discussing Islam and all the topics related to Islam and things that affect all of us in today's society. So once again, go to Anchor and anchor.fm or go to your Play Store and download the Anchor app, and you can get started just like I have. So I'll leave you by saying Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Thank you for listening. And that's all that I'm here to point out today.
Can I add something to this, Chris? Chris?
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, Kenny. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing fabulous. Alhamdulillah.
Hey, okay, I got a couple comments here and a couple points to make, and I'm going to get to some of those verses that you had quoted. And I'm sorry that you missed the first half hour of the show, because Chris and I addressed a lot of these issues that you are describing here in the first half of the show. And when we get done here, I'm going to put this on my YouTube channel. I'm going to put it on my Facebook pages, and you can go in and listen to what we were saying about the justness of God, the righteousness of God, and we were using a lot of key passages that really have not been discussed since you came in. But I want to start with Genesis chapter 3, with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And you spoke about, why would God kill somebody for, stealing a loaf of bread, or why would God kill Uzzah for, daring or having the temerity to touch the Ark of the Covenant, the most holy object on the earth. If you look at the story of Adam and Eve, Eve simply ate of a fruit, and God banished them from the Garden of Eden. I know there's a separate little spin on it that Muhammad put on it, saying that he banished them from heaven. Why would God banish Adam and Eve for committing such a simple little picadillo of eating a fruit? Can you explain that to me, if that is a just God?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. Thank you for that question. Yeah, absolutely. And for one, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he's not the one that discussed this. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our God, our Creator, in the Quran, that explains the situation as Adam and Eve slipped, and they made a grave error, they made a mistake, they did not follow His commandment. And so we know that there's consequences to commandments, but once again, they weren't killed for this.
You're breaking up. I can't quite understand what you're saying. Hold on, let me put these in real quick. I'm sorry. I want to make sure that I understand you clearly, because I don't want to take your words out of context. Okay, go ahead. Try it again. I'm sorry, sir.
Okay, sure. Well, in the Quran, it tells the story, and it says that basically Adam and Eve both slipped. That it doesn't put the sin on Eve as it is put in the Bible, that she lured Adam into committing sin. It says that they both slipped, and because of this, they were thrown out of paradise.
Now, what was their sin? What was their sin?
Their sin was that they didn't follow the commandment of God,
which was
to stay away from that particular tree.
Okay.
Let me give you an example. Once again, I said that I believe that everything that we face in this life is a test. Matter of fact, that's the title of my next book, Everything is a Test. And because of this, we're presented with things of the world that are enticing to us. And so Satan come and he whispered into their consciousness, and he tells them, hey, look, you can be equated with God. You can be mortal if you go and eat from this particular fruit. So that particular fruit, they had plenty of other fruit to eat from, but they were tempted by and seduced by this particular fruit. In modern times, or an example of this is the fact that we have, let's say, pork, for instance. As Muslims, we don't eat pork. Pork is very cheap. It's a very cheap meat to eat. But it's a test to people. And God says in the Bible, 3 different places, do not consume the flesh of swine, and it's repeated in the Quran. And yet people still consume the pork, and it's a test. And so in the same manner that we consume the flesh of swine, Adam and Eve consumed the fruit that they were tempted by, and there's punishment for that. What is the punishment for consuming pork? Well, for one, science has proven that there's no health benefit to it whatsoever. It fills your stomach, but it gives you absolutely there's no health benefit to it whatsoever. Actually, on the contrary, it's bad for you to eat. Yet, people are still eating it. Matter of fact, Christmas time's coming. It's going to be on every table in Christian households, even though God says not to do it. And so there's consequences for that. So the consequence for Adam and Eve slipping, as the Quran puts it, and falling into that sin, was that now they're going to have to, live on the earth. They were taken out of paradise. They're going to live on the earth. They're going to have to actually work for their food, whereas before it was given to them freely. But because they wanted even more, God had already provided for them, gave them everything that they needed, told them what to stay away from, but they still wanted more, and there was their sin. But that's not an unjust God. That's God saying, this is the consequence for this act that you did.
Okay, so the consequence when God tells Uzzah, don't touch the ark, or this is the consequence, because it looks to me like you're being a little capricious here.
Well, if you consider why Uzzah was touching the ark, he was touching the ark because it was about to fall over, and he was just simply trying to balance it. One could argue, okay, well, God said don't touch it, and that's what he meant, period. But also, I believe that, in the Quran it says that God is closer to us than our own jugular vein, so he knows our intentions, he knows what we're doing and why we're doing it. Even if we're trying to deceive ourselves in the process, our God is never deceived. And so certainly our Creator, the one who created Uzzah, would know that Uzzah was simply, based on what the Bible states, that Uzzah was simply trying to stop it from falling over. And God, in being just, as a Muslim, I don't believe that would be just to kill the man.
Okay, so if God did not kill us, let's just flip this over then. So the ark is falling over, and Uzzah, I'm going to get that. He pushes the ark back up and balances it. And all of the people know that God has given the order not to touch the ark, and Uzzah comes up and touches the ark and does not die. Where is God then?
Repeat that question, Eric. I'm so sorry.
Okay, let's just say that God did not kill Uzzah. Let's just say he didn't do it. And everybody knows that if you touch the ark, then God is going to kill you. And the ark is falling, and Uzzah goes up there and grabs it and pushes it up and puts his hands on it and keeps it from falling, and he does not die. Is God just then?
Well, if you consider, once again, like I mentioned, that, and I believe that you would believe the same thing as a Christian, that God knows us better than we know ourselves. So he knows our innermost thoughts. He knows exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how we try to, even the wrong that we do, how we're just trying to justify it. And so in that situation where Uzzah was trying to stop the Ark of the Covenant from falling over, he's actually trying to do a good thing by trying to say, wait a minute, this thing's falling, and not wanting it to break, or whatever, whatever the case might be, whatever his reasons were based on what the story in the Bible. But certainly a just God that knows us better than we know ourselves would know that Uzzah was trying to stop the thing from falling, and which would be, in Islam, it would be deemed as a good thing. As a matter of fact, in Islam, if we take something out of the roadway, we believe that we're being blessed for doing so. So in this situation, if someone's trying to prevent something from falling, and especially the Ark of the Covenant, trying to prevent it from being damaged, which could be the only reason why he would reach out to stop it from falling, certainly our Creator knows that. And to kill him for trying to do something that was good, to me seems to be unjust.
Okay, well, I would say just the opposite is true, though. Because if God says, hey, do not do this, or I am going to kill you if you do touch this ark without my permission, and he doesn't kill you, then he is not a just God.
Well, note in Genesis, what you mentioned about Adam and Eve, it said that if they touch that tree, they will surely die, right? That's what the verses say, that they will surely die. But God didn't kill them for touching the tree. They ate the fruit, they consumed the fruit, but he didn't kill them in that instance. And so
there's a lot of variations on how that verse is read, and I don't want to get into it, but it says that you will surely die, dying, and continually die is how the Hebrew comes up. But that's neither here nor there. But what I'm saying is that in the Garden of Eden, God says, hey, you can eat of every tree here, but this one tree, you're going to be punished. And God says over here in, what was this, the book of, was that Samuel? Yeah, 2 Samuel. He tells Uzzah, don't touch this ark. He tells the people, don't touch the ark with your hands because your hands are unclean. And this is a holy thing. This is my mercy seat. This is where I reign on earth. Don't you dare touch me or my mercy seat. And they do, regardless of the intent. If he does not punish them, then he is not a just God. Even though you might have the best intentions, God would not be just then if he did not kill Uzzah. And I want to go back over to this one that she brought up about Deuteronomy, having all the children killed of the Amorites.
Notice what it says in that 2 Samuel. It says, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen stumbled. And the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. But notice, so Uzzah, basically in his reflexes, so it seems, based on my interpretation of this, it says Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen stumbled. So, obviously he might have done this simply by reaction. He might not have even thought about it. He might have just reacted, just like we do if we see a cup fixing to fall off of a table. He just reached out and tried to stop it from falling, and therefore he was killed for that.
Yeah,
and so
Lane in the chat, Elaine made a really good point here that I was just reading. Said one might think that he demonstrated a lack of faith in reaching out to steady the ark, as God couldn't take care of the ark himself. You could throw in all kinds of different scenarios. Man, just as well as I do, mankind has justified sin and rebellion and disobedience to God in 1,000 different ways. And to me, this just sounds like another way. But I wanted to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 2, if we can, when we were talking about why did God kill the Amorites or have the Amorites killed. Just a little context here. What is not often brought up is that the Amorites, as the Israelites were coming out of Egypt during the Exodus, the Amorites would not allow them to pass. The Amorites were the enemies of God's chosen people. The Amorites were the people who were trying to prevent God from fulfilling his promises to the children of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I might add.
What verses are you talking about there?
Deuteronomy 2, 33 through 34. That's one that you cited, I thought.
Yeah, that's it. Just before the verses that he quoted, that's where it actually says that they didn't allow them to go through.
Yeah, and here you have, Deuteronomy 9:5, it says that it's not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you're going to possess their land, but it's because of the wickedness of the nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So when God sends the Israelites in to kill the Amorites, and the king specifically, he's doing it because this people, this Amorite people, is a completely unrepentant people. And that includes the women and the children who support the adults who fight in battle and who've caused the Israelites from possessing the land, this land that God has promised them. And as the children grow older, the children themselves, you could make and this is what we often hear in the abortion cases, and I don't agree with it entirely, but well, I can't take care of this kid, the kid's going to grow up and he's not going to have a good life, and they justify it that way. But here, these people were so debased, so sinful, so in rebellion to God, unrepentant to God, that even the children would grow up to rebel against God. So that's why that God had all of them killed. Number one, they're preventing him from fulfilling his promises. Number two, they would be nothing but unrepentant sinners against the people of Israel for their entire lives.
Yeah, and I actually agree with that in regards to. I do believe that God certainly knows a person's destiny, what they're going to live to do if they were to grow from a child to an adult. And so I do believe that. I think we see, with natural catastrophes and whole, cities are demolished, and many children die that were innocent. So I certainly believe that. I believe that that God does operate in that fashion. So, once again, I by no means mean to imply ever that our God is unjust. I believe he operates by his own will. But if we go through, that's a good explanation for that particular verse. But if we keep going through, and I noticed that you detoured off of the issue about Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant being killed for simply just reacting to the thing falling. So it seems, I don't believe a just God would kill someone simply for reacting spontaneously to.
But okay, then the question is then what would have happened if God wouldn't have killed him? Then what do the people think? God said, don't do X or Y is going to happen. Well, if he does X and Y does not happen, then what did the people of Israel do?
Well, it boils down to a difference of difference of theology and what you believe as a Christian, what I believe as a Muslim. I certainly believe that, matter of fact, in the Quran, in chapter An-Nisa, it says that if anyone does evil or wrongs his own soul, and if anyone earns sin, he earns it against his own soul, for Allah is full of knowledge and wisdom. So, right there in this verse, it's stated basically that no matter what someone else did, they're going to learn a lesson from it one way or the other. So to think that God would kill someone for reacting spontaneously. Let me ask you this: if the Ark of the Covenant was to have fallen, who would have picked it back up? And I'm not saying that God couldn't pick it back up. He can use a miracle to pick the thing up. But what I'm saying is that if the thing fell over, and if it was riding and it fell because the ox stumbled, obviously someone had to put it in a carriage or whatever it was being transported on for it to fall. Someone had to touch it along the way somewhere. And this thing.
Now, if you look at how the ark was designed, it was carried with poles, and they could have just picked it up by reinserting the poles in the holes in the side of the ark, and they could have just picked it up and put it back on the.
Yeah. Well, nevertheless, however it's transported, it was being transported by an oxen. The oxen stumbled, and to prevent this holy thing from falling and maybe shattering, because it's just made out of whatever it was made out of, to prevent it from falling. Uzzah reached out probably spontaneously, but the way the verses read, he's reached out to prevent it from falling, which would be a good act. So God kill us for doing something good. And it goes back to the Adam and Eve thing. God said, don't touch this. Well, they touched it. He didn't kill them for not touching it. Eventually they're going to die a slow death, but the verses in the Bible say that surely you will die. He doesn't put a time limit on it, but he says, surely you will die. Inevitably, they're going to die eventually. They did die eventually, but they didn't die right then. In the same manner, a just God would say, okay, Uzzah, I told you not to do this, but you did it anyways. But instead of forgiving you, I'm going to kill you right now, because you react by instinct to reach out and stop this thing that you know is very holy.
Okay, well, but the question still stands. I mean, I understand, and I get your your explanation for it. I completely understand that. I mean, what are you going to do? You let the ark fall? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I get that, but the question still stands is that what would have the Israelite people seen if God says, if you do X, I'm going to do Y. The person does X, and then God does not do that. Is that a God? Is that God? I mean, can he? I mean, what he's basically doing is he's lying.
Well, the thing is, as a Muslim, the Quran says that Allah forgives all sins except for the sin of associating partners with Him, right? And so, in regards to what you just mentioned, if we go to the other verse of the Bible where God and Joshua refuses to accept the repentance of Ashon,
No, wait a second. You kind of got on me about avoiding this.
But no,
I'm just trying to,
No, I'm circling the block. I'm getting.
All right. Okay.
I'm just going to circle the block, but Uzzah certainly could have had the opportunity to seek forgiveness and to repent for reacting spontaneously. But the verse of the Bible said that he killed him right there at the foot of the Ark of the Covenant, right? Well, so that shows a God that wasn't willing to, despite him reacting spontaneously, so it seems, and making this error. He didn't even give him a chance to repent. And in Joshua, he refuses to accept the repentance of Eshon. And after that, he kills all of his daughters and even the animals because of the wrong that Eshon did. So it boils down to whether or not you believe that God would be just in killing a man without giving him first the opportunity to seek forgiveness, for one, and also killing for reacting spontaneously, and also killing for trying to prevent the thing from possibly breaking, being damaged. I don't think that God would be just in doing that because He knows us better than we know ourselves. And that's just how I feel about it. You're welcome to feel.
Well, the way I see that is that if God does not do what He says, then He is not God. He's lying. He's not following through with His justice. And He says that if you touch the Ark of the Covenant, it doesn't matter what your excuse is. You lay your hands on your humanly hands on this holy. When we start talking about what is holy, we talk about what is separate, completely separate. God is completely separate. Then that is a sin against God. And if He says that you don't touch it, guess what? You don't touch it. And if you do, regardless of what your justification or what your reasoning is, if He does not punish you, if He says that, hey, if you touch the Ark of the Covenant, you're going to die, and you don't die, and the people around Him see that He does not die, then what are the people of Israel? So what are they supposed to think of God? Well, God, you just said that if somebody touches the Ark of the Covenant, they're going to die, and He put His hands on it, and he didn't die. So what else can we do? You see that it's a problem that goes in. Or that circles completely around, and He has to follow through on His justice. There has to be a price to pay for rebellion against God. And this is where we start talking about this, sacrificial atonement, the necessity for Christ. I've been blabbing mouthing too long. I'm gonna sit down, and shut up, and I'm gonna let my friend come back. He left. Jay must have left. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, all right, no problem, Eric. Hey, Jay, are you still there?
Jay is not in the house.
He's not in the house anymore?
No.
That's okay. So it basically boils down to, from what I was hearing from between you and Kenny's dialogue, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that if God commands something and gives the consequence for not doing that command, right? So all that's laid out. So I command this, but if you do this, or if you do what I say not to, this is going to happen to you, right? Now, if God does not follow through with what He said that the consequence would be, I believe that God is unjust. But Kenny, you believe that God wouldn't be unjust. Is that correct? or sorry, that God would be just.
Yeah, I was about to say that, wouldn't I believe in the mercy of God, and I believe that that's why we say in Islam, he's Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, he's the most gracious, the most merciful. The Quran says that he forgives all sins, and he gives everyone an opportunity to repent and to seek forgiveness. And, so I'm basing that on what I believe. And if we look at these things logically and say, okay, well, if a man's reaching out to prevent this thing from falling, and God knows his intention, like I've mentioned already, He knows our intention. He knows why we're doing what we're doing. Then a just God, a forgiving God, a loving God, a merciful God would consider that a blessing to that man for stopping this highly respected and valuable, relic, to preventing it from being destroyed. But instead, he destroyed the man for trying to do an act of goodness. And so the Quran says in our Father, in Surah Al-Fatih, it says, "And no bearer of burdens will bear the burden of another." So I believe that we're all going to be recompensed for the good and the evil that we do in this world, and which is why as Muslims we go to prayer 5 times a day and we seek forgiveness and are thankful to our Lord. And I believe in the complete mercy of God, and I don't believe that He would kill people unjustly. I don't believe He would kill people over a loaf of bread because another person didn't get to eat the bread.
I want to ask you about something about that, Kenny, because you had mentioned earlier that you said the discussion is about the character or the righteousness and the justness of God. And when they tried to bring up the hadith, which hadith was this? This was let's see, where is this? Sahih Muslim 2767. Where it says, on the day of resurrection, some of the Muslims will come with sins like mountains, but Allah will forgive them and put the sins onto the Jews and Christians. And then you say, well, we're not here to talk about the justice of the God of the Quran, but yet here you're citing the justice, or trying to cite the justice of the Quran, saying that God is, forgiving and He can forgive these things. Well, which one is it? I guess is my question.
Well, Chris asked me a direct question about what I believed. And so I answered that question based on what I believe. In regards to the hadith, because I'm unfamiliar with that particular hadith, I would need to study that hadith and study the context behind it, what was going on historically, why was this said, in order to speak on it. Because I have no knowledge of that particular hadith, I'm not equipped to speak on that hadith. I can only speak, as a Muslim, I can only speak about things that I have knowledge of. So,
hey, Kenny.
Yeah.
You just said that you can only speak of things that you have knowledge on, but when you quoted Deuteronomy chapter 2, I believe it was 33 and 34, those verses, you didn't have the full context and knowledge of those verses, though,
Sure
when
I did.
you quoted them, right?
Sure I did. Absolutely.
But when Eric gave you the context to it, you said that it made sense.
Well, it makes sense from the standpoint that we know that there's natural disasters and things that take place in the world, and that children die. That's what I made a point of. That God, He does what He does, and it's a test to us. But to assume that God can have killed innocent children for the acts of their fathers, I don't think you nor I or anyone listening would believe that that's justice, that we should punish someone, or punish our children for that matter, children for something that you or I have done. The children have nothing to do with that. Now,
just to go back on what I was speaking about, though, you quoted Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 33 to 34. But if you would have read verses 29 and 30, it actually gives you the context for 33 and 34. But you didn't mention the context of it when you first brought it up. And then you said simply just touching an ark. You didn't give the full context behind it. You didn't say that God had commanded them not to touch it, and whoever did touch it would surely die. You didn't give that context to it. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're criticizing Christianity it seems that you don't have the full context and historical background for the story speaking about, be able to speak about it, but yet when we question you on the Quran, you have to have all of that before you even talk about it.
Well, for one, you just debated two different things here. For one, we're talking. Your question was about the Hadith, and you just said that when I'm talking about the Quran, I have to understand the context. Well, I agree. Yes, I do need to understand the context of the Quran, and I also need to understand the context of Hadith. But for you to assume that I didn't know the context behind these verses is.
Hey, Robert, you need to mute your. Chris, can you mute Brad?
Yeah.
If you remember right, I had about 5 minutes to present my case, and I had mentioned 5 different verses of the Bible to make my points, and I wasn't trying to expound on each one of those and trying to explain the background of each one of those. I could easily do that,
but why
right now, if you like, I tell you exactly what's going on in each one of those verses. But I merely made those points regarding those 5 verses to establish the grounds for what I was going to talk about.
But to establish the grounds of a just God or an unjust God, shouldn't you have to give the context behind the claims to it if the God is unjust or just?
Right, and that's been established already today. We've talked about Uzzah in particular. We've talked about...
Okay, so let's start off with this. Talking about Deuteronomy. When we know about what happened and the context behind it, do you believe that he...
Assalamu alaikum, this is author Kenny Bomer. Welcome back to part 2 of the discussion on the radio program Radio Free Kafiristan, on the segment The Cross and the Crescent, discussing whether or not the God of the Bible is just or unjust. Thank you for listening.
To say is that when you're criticizing Christianity, it seems that you don't have the full context and historical background for the story speaking about, be able to speak about it, but yet when we question you on the Quran, you have to have all of that before you even talk about it.
Well, for one, you just debated two different things here. For one, we're talking. Your question was about the Hadith, and you just said that when I'm talking about the Quran, I have to understand the context. Well, I agree. Yes, I do need to understand the context of the Quran, and I also need to understand the context of Hadith. But for you to assume that I didn't know the context behind these verses is.
Hey, Robert, you need to mute your. Chris, can you mute Brad?
Yeah.
If you remember right, I had about 5 minutes to present my case, and I had mentioned 5 different verses of the Bible to make my points, and I wasn't trying to expound on each one of those and trying to explain the background of each one of those. I could easily do that,
but why
right now, if you like, I tell you exactly what's going on in each one of those verses. But I merely made those points regarding those 5 verses to establish the grounds for what I was going to talk about.
But to establish the grounds of a just God or an unjust God, shouldn't you have to give the context behind the claims to it if the God is unjust or just?
Right, and that's been established already today. We've talked about Uzzah in particular. We've talked about...
Okay, so let's start off with this. Talking about Deuteronomy. When we know about what happened and the context behind it, do you believe that God was unjust or just?
I believe as a Muslim, I believe that would be unjust. I'm saying basically, I believe that's what's written in the Bible, the God that would be perceived in the Bible, which is why Marcion and the Marcionites would believe the same thing, and they did believe the same thing. That they believed that the God of the Old Testament was unjust. I encourage you to read, about the Marcionites, and these same verses that we're talking about. This is not, and I want to correct you on something, that I'm not here trying to criticize the Bible. I've said no critical word of the Bible. We've been talking about the context of these issues and these particular verses, but I'm not here criticizing as a Muslim. I'm not criticizing the Bible. I believe there's good in the Bible, and I believe there's things in the Bible that are consistent with what's been revealed. But nevertheless, we've already discussed these points. And as a Muslim,
okay, if God can just simply, let's just say, forgive them, right? Let me just quote from your Quran here for a second. I'm going to quote Surah 8, verse 12 and 13 together. It says, "Remember when your Lord inspired to the angels, I am with you, so strengthen those who have believed. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. So strike upon the necks and strike from them every fingertip. That is because they oppose Allah and His Messenger. And whoever opposes Allah and His Messenger, indeed Allah is severe in penalty." So if somebody was to go against and oppose Muhammad, so say there was a command for somebody to do something, let's say, and they oppose that command, they would be opposing Allah and Muhammad. So therefore, a strict penalty would ensue, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but this is a totally different context. If you study what's going on in Surah Al-Anfal, you'll see that this is in the midst of a battle. So this is
Which battle would that be?
Let me think about this for a moment.
Because it doesn't give the battle name in the Quran. I know which battle it is, but it doesn't actually specify it in the Quran. It was written later in time. So to say that this is a specific battle, you really can't, because it's not in the Quran, sir.
Well, it was a battle with the Quraysh, and it's a battle. So anyone can look up Surah Al-Anfal and study the tafsir of what's going on in these. As a matter of fact, it's the Battle of Badr. It slipped my mind for a moment. But
so what you're saying is you can't take the Quran alone. You actually have to have other material to understand what your Quran says then, correct?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, then without the tafsir, how would you know that Surah 8 was speaking about the Battle of Badr?
Okay, so I've studied tafsir, which in my course in Michigan University, it's a course titled Analytical Tafsir. This means analytical interpretation of literally every word and every verse of the Quran. And what we're doing is we go through and we analyze what the Arabic words say and what they mean, and put the interpretation together based on what the Arabic says in the Quran. So the Quran speaks for itself. Now there are things outside of the Quran which are revealed by the Prophet Muhammad through the Hadith, which expound upon the things in the Quran, but that's another issue. We're talking about is your claim that these people were killed, in your critique against the Quran, and I don't think that you realize, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, I don't know, but this was regarding the Battle of Badr. So they're actually...
Well, you do realize that it wasn't the Muslims that did the killing in the battle, though, right? Because when we further read in Surah 8:17, it says, "And you did not kill them, but it was Allah who killed them. And you threw them not, O Muhammad, when you threw, but it was Allah who threw, that He might test the believers with a good test. Indeed, Allah."
Well, it's not. That's nothing surprising.
How is that a just God if He's killing somebody just because they oppose Him?
What this means is
couldn't He have just told them to? Couldn't He just forgive them?
Yeah, by the will of our Creator.
Argument when it comes to the ark, right? I'm just trying to see where your standard lies.
Okay, well, the standard
God to simply forgive something when it comes to the ark, and not bound Himself by His command that He's already made. Okay. So by the same sense, is Allah bound by the command that He's already made, which He displays in the Quran?
What you're talking about is two vastly different things. We're talking about a statue or some kind of relic about to fall over, and a man was killed and laying at the foot of the Ark of the Covenant because he was trying to prevent it from falling. And
we're talking about His people disobeying the command of God.
Please don't interrupt me.
That's what we're talking about.
Please don't interrupt me. And you're also trying to conflate that with the Battle of Badr, where Muslims are engaged in a battle, and by God's will, once again, I think you would believe, and I believe, that God decides the day that we're born, and He decides the day that we die. So no matter what someone else does or does not do, if your time to come has been established, then it's by God's will that that's going to happen. No matter if a man's killed in the street, in a mugging, in a bank robbery, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how it happens. It's by God's will. Only God allows that to happen, right? So
okay, that's totally different. For my final point here is that if God commands something, that God is unjust if he does not follow through with the command that he gives. That means that he can change his mind whenever he would like to. And to me, that is an unjust God and a God that you cannot trust whatsoever. We do have Rad. Hopefully the sound's a little bit better. Rad, I'll give you a couple minutes here, and then I'll let Kenny wrap it up, so I'm not sure how much time we have left. You can unmute yourself, Rad?
He's muted. Can you unmute him, Chris?
Yeah.
There he goes. All right, he's back.
Hey, Rad, you there?
Did you get the work done?
Robert, you there?
The person I'm waiting on is done faster than expected. So.
Yeah, I'm here.
We're gonna have to mute him again until he can unmute him. So he can unmute himself as well. So.
We can
Hey,
hear
Rad,
you.
you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
hear me?
hear you a lot better. Go ahead.
Hello? All right. Well, all right, cool. You know, I stopped here for a second. So I just want to say to Kenny really quickly, I mean, well, there's many things that you said. Overall, basically, that I heard you consistently say is that you decide, you judge what is just and right for God to command, for God to do, etc. For instance, a great deal was spent on the guy that touched the ark when it was falling down, okay? But God said specifically, do not touch it at all. As a matter of fact, it was brought up by others that it was carried around on poles. Now you can say, well, the guy was just doing this, doing that, whatever. It was a knee-jerk reaction to hold it up. No, God specifically commanded, do not touch it. That is the level of our God. When he says something, he means it. No matter what excuse, no matter what action you have, your reaction to what he has commanded. Okay? All right? So when he says don't do something, he means don't do something. There's no excuse. There's no reaction. There's no justification. He says don't do it. It's simple. Okay? That's point number one. Point number two, again, well, getting back to point number one as well, again, your whole thing on what is just and right,
This is a waste of time. I have no clue what he's saying. It's a complete waste of time.
Hey, Robert, can you hear me? We can't. You have very bad signal and you keep cutting out wherever you are. I'm gonna have to mute you again, man. All right, Eric, did you have anything you want to follow up with Kenny?
Well, I was just going to point out that God, when he struck Uzzah, it was for Uzzah's irreverence. If you look what the verse says, it's for his irreverence, and it doesn't say that, you know, it says for the oxen nearly upset it. So it isn't just an issue of, okay, just let me finish, Kenny. Kenny, let me finish this, and then you can go ahead. It isn't just the fact that Uzzah touched the ark, it's the fact that God told him not to, and by touching something that is holy, that's like going up to God and grabbing hold of him because you think that God needs your help. And so when God punishes him for this, he's being just. He's saying, okay, I'm punishing you for doing something that I told you not to do. And again, this is the point that I'm trying to make, and that you haven't really addressed. What happens if God does not punish this man for doing something that he explicitly said not to do? He is not just then. He's a liar. And God, that's not part of God's character. That's all I had to say about that. And Kenny, thank you for coming in today. We appreciate you coming. Even though we disagree with you, we really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it. Appreciate you having me on. It boils down to a difference in what you believe about God versus what I believe about God. I believe God is completely just and completely merciful, and that he forgives all sins except for the sin of associating partners with him, and that he weighs our actions and our deeds and the words that we speak. He weighs everything and is fully aware of our intention behind what we're doing. There's nothing in the Bible that says why Uzzah reached out to grab the covenant, or the ark, rather. And so, many things could be said about and speculate about why he did this, why he did that, why God did this, or why God did that. It's still going to boil down to what you believe about God and what I believe about God. This is one of the reasons why I accepted Islam nearly 32 years ago, that I believe that God is just. I believe he doesn't require someone to suffer and to die. I believe that he requires us to simply turn to him as often as possible to seek forgiveness and to seek his mercy. And I believe he's completely just, and he's going to deal with us accordingly. And sometimes the things that we do will be reserved for the day of judgment, and that goes for blessings and recompense for sin alike. But I do believe as a Muslim that if we seek forgiveness often enough, the number of sins that we accumulate before the day of judgment are minimalized, and we actually, every time we do go to prayer, we seek forgiveness, and we do kind and righteous deeds, such as removing something from a roadway, or trying to help an old lady cross the road, or trying to prevent the Ark of the Covenant from falling. I believe that our Creator sees those as good things, and that we are blessed by that. And all those little acts of kindness also remove small sins from our lives. And so that's what I believe as a Muslim. I did want to mention one thing in regards to Eric. I know a couple of weeks ago you had mentioned my book, Consider Islam Disproving the Patriots of Propaganda, and you were criticizing me about a story that I told about a man that spoke out at a fundraising event after a motorcycle accident that I had. And initially you said that you were basically criticizing me for saying that the man condemned me to hell, which indeed he did condemn me to hell. But then afterwards you referred to him as an a-hole for doing the very thing that I said that he did, which you contradicted yourself in that program. You criticized me unjustly for saying that this man condemned me to hell. When he looked right at me, I was there. I know what he said, and I know how he said it, and I know what his intentions were. The man, by telling me that if I didn't accept the Lord Jesus Christ as my Lord and personal Savior, that I was going to hell. You were criticizing me for that, saying that he didn't condemn me. But then later in the program, you called him an a-hole, and you also called the Prophet Muhammad an a-hole, and you called Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our God, our Creator, an a-hole. And you know good and well that we as Muslims, we say Allah in the Arabic language, which means our Creator. We're not talking about anyone else. We're talking about the only Creator, the Creator of Adam and Eve. And you talked about what the Quran describes about hell in the description of hell in the Quran. And I think you were doing so unaware of how many verses of the Bible describe hell. And I'm just going to tell you a couple of just one real quick, and we can end. Revelation 21. Just let me say this one verse real quick.
Hey, Kenny, this is off topic.
Yeah, I know, but I think it.
We're talking about
I think it's on topic in regards to.
What we can do, Kenny.
But we're still talking about God's justice here. We're talking about the recompense of hell, and so this still applies. And this is why I was closing with this. Because in Revelation 21, in Revelation 21, bear with me one.
Kenny, it's not a part of the topic, and you know it.
It is on my show on Tuesday. Kenny, if you want to come on my show on Tuesday, we can talk about it on Tuesday. I would love to talk about it.
It absolutely is a part of the topic, and being the fact that Eric spent so much time trying to discredit and undermine my book and me and the Quran and Prophet Muhammad and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his very creator, I think it's only just to let me finish this segment regarding the justice of our Creator in the Bible, whether he's just or unjust.
You're saying that, Kenny, for a second here, you're saying that the Creator is the biblical God?
I'm saying the Creator is the God of the Bible, he's the God of the Jewish Scriptures, and he's the God of the Quran. The Creator.
Okay, so the God of the Jewish Scriptures, who you could just condemn to be unjust, you just claim to be the Creator, right?
I didn't say the Jews were unjust.
You said that the God of the Jewish Scriptures was unjust, and you quoted 5 different verses
No,
in your
let's clarify. Let's
clarify.
clarify.
Scriptures was.
Let's clarify. I'm going to say what I said when I first began speaking, that I wasn't there to say that God is unjust. By no means. As a Muslim, I would never say such a thing. I'm not saying that
verses said that this is an unjust God.
I believe that those verses, that a God, that if these verses were true, that I believe a God that would write those things or reveal these things or do these particular acts, that God would be unjust. But as
Can
a
you
Muslim,
prove that those verses are not from the Creator?
You know and I know both, that as a Muslim, there's portions of the Bible that I accept wholeheartedly.
Can you prove that these verses are not from the Creator?
And there's portions of the Bible that I completely reject.
Okay, but can you prove that these verses that you quoted are not from the Creator?
Well, what I can do is prove absolutely, and why can I say that? Why do I say that? It's because we know that the Bible was written, depending on what version we're talking about, was written by 66 anonymous authors.
So how can you determine
that? 66.
Hold on.
That's not true, Kenny. Let's get your numbers right.
If you ask me a question,
Kenny, you can't say you accept the biblical God and the Jewish scriptures.
If you ask me a question,
then say
give
you
me a
don't
chance to
accept
answer.
it. There has to be evidence to support that these verses are not from the Creator. You have to
if you ask me a question,
say that they are not from the Creator.
If you ask me a question, it's only right that you give me an opportunity to answer that question.
Okay,
and which is what I was doing. You study it. Everyone who's listening study it. The fact of the matter is that these books, even in the Old Testament, there's no not one of the verses in any chapter of the Bible claim that this book was written from God.
So what you're saying,
thus saith the Lord. It said, thus saith the Lord. Yes, that comes from God. When it says, thus saith the Lord, that's from God.
Once again, you've interrupted me. But
when you say something that's absolutely not true, we're going to interrupt you because you made several errors here. You said there's 66 authors of the Bible. No, there is not. There's 66 books, but not 66 authors.
Well, once again, that depends. That depends on which version of the Bible we're talking about. We're talking about the one with 73 books, 78 books, 88 books, 66 books.
Hey, Kenny, I stated that the God that you accept, the Creator, is the God of the Jewish scriptures. You believe in some of the scriptures and you don't accept all of the scriptures. How do you, as a Muslim, determine what is truly from the Creator and what is not?
Simple.
This is the sixth time I've asked you this question.
Right, very, very simple. No, you didn't ask me that. You didn't ask it in that way. No, you did not. But let me answer your question. It's quite simple. The Quran is called Al-Furqan, the criterion between what's right and what's wrong. So we take verses of the Bible, and if they coincide and they agree with the verses of the Quran, we fully accept those verses wholeheartedly.
So your judgment is confirmation bias then, right?
No,
if it confirms to your bias, then it is true. If it goes against your bias, then it is false, right?
No, it's not.
That is exactly what you just described.
This is a matter of criterion, right? So we know that the Bible doesn't make any claim whatsoever that it was written by God. We know that it was written by men. Even if it's the 5 books of Deuteronomy that are in question about who actually wrote the books of Deuteronomy.
But the problem is your Quran says that your Allah revealed it to the prophet.
Okay, but that does not mean that our Creator wrote any single verse of the Bible. That doesn't imply that whatsoever.
Okay, let's just say
that make that claim.
Allah said that He revealed the Torah to Moses. Can you point me to the Torah that your Allah revealed to Moses?
Absolutely not. You know why? Because the very books that we're talking about right now, there's no reason for us to believe that those books actually came from Moses.
Can you point me to one verse that your Allah revealed to Moses in the Torah?
No.
So then during Muhammad's time, when he had the Torah on his lap, he put his hand and he swore that he believed in the person that sent it and the person that revealed it type thing, as in Moses and Allah, then Muhammad was mistaken then, right? Or do we not have the same Torah that Muhammad had at his time?
Now you're beating a straw man, okay? Because you're trying to imply that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, had the Torah sitting on his lap. No, he did not. What these verses mean, what they signify, is that when
you're called for the Torah and it was brought to him.
Again, you're interrupting me. You're interrupting me. And what this means is that we believe what was revealed to all of the prophets, 124,000 that we believe prophets and messengers that have come to mankind from our Lord, right? And we believe all of their messages. That doesn't mean that we have documentation of all their messages. The Quran is literally the only book where Allah says that it is He that has revealed this book, and it is He that has promised to preserve it until the day of judgment. Why? Because the previous people didn't follow their books properly. You, as a Christian, you eat pork, and God says not to eat pork. I'm using this.
He also says not to eat camel, but Muslims do today.
Okay, no, but
I'm a Muslim. I've never eaten camel.
But
So
you know,
There's Muslims across the Muslim world that eat camel, and same book, same chapter says not to eat camel.
See, that's beating a straw man. You can't.
Well, no, it's not.
It's
You
not.
don't
It's the
follow
truth.
what I took about or something else. So don't use the standard, please.
You're beating a straw man. That's plain and simple. So because you know what I'm getting at. There's no way that we can confirm what has been revealed in the Bible is literal words from our Creator. We can assume that the ones that are consistent with what the Quran says have been led by our Creator. But that doesn't mean that there is literal speech or that He led the people to write those particular things. And so when we take these verses that we've mentioned and we say, why would God kill a man for simply trying to balance this Ark of the Covenant, prevent it from falling, and we say that I believe that would be unjust, I'm basing that on the Bible itself. What does the Bible say? So I wasn't here to critique the Bible. I wasn't here to criticize the Bible. I wasn't here to criticize Christianity. I was here to talk about these verses and discuss these verses that other Christians, early Christians, and Christians even today, as I mentioned in the article about modern Marcionism, that still exists today, where people reject the Old Testament because why? They read these things that we just discussed today and say, man, that doesn't seem like a just God would do that. So this is not, I don't want to make this a Muslim Christian issue. I'm calling from the standpoint of okay, let's simply just look at the Bible and what does the Bible say? Not make it a reason to argue and be rude to one another. By no means is that my intention. And by no means have I tried to say anything that's derogatory about the Bible or anyone who believes what they want to believe. I don't care what you believe. Plain and simple. But
Kenny, if I was to just slow down here, and if I criticize Islam and I quote your Quran, and I say that this is an unjust God, or God has lied, or something like that, when I'm reading that verse, am I attacking your Quran or your religion in any way?
If you're not looking at the full context, you absolutely are. And by saying
Actually,
that,
hold on. By saying that,
you asked me a question once again, and then you interrupt me.
Slow down here. You
asked me a question. I would like to give my full answer before you.
Kenny, just a second. So you just stated that if I gave the full context when I criticized the Quran, and I said that your God or your Allah was unjust for doing something, as long as I give the context, it's okay. But if I don't give the context when I do it, then I would be attacking the Quran and or religion. But in your opening, you gave no context whatsoever. You brought up Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 33 and 34, and you stated after you read the verse that you do not believe that that is the actions of a just God. So you're making a determination based upon two simple verses without the context being used, but yet you're saying that you're not attacking a religion nor a book. But yet you just stated that if I didn't use the context for the Quran, then I'm attacking the Quran in Islam. So why isn't it the same for you as it would be for somebody else?
Look, Chris, in the first 5 minutes, I didn't mention only one verse. I didn't mention only two verses. I mentioned 5 verses, and I laid the foundation of what I was going to talk about. And since I've been on, we have talked about those things. We have talked about the context. So I'm not sure where you're, what you're trying to accuse me of. It seems a bit once again you're beating a straw man here, because you're trying to imply something that just isn't there.
Explain what I said. Explain what I said as a straw man. You're using that word too much, and it's not appropriate. Explain why it's a straw man.
In the first 5 minutes, you gave some opening that I didn't hear, and you told me that I had 5 minutes to give some kind of an opening, right? And so during that opening, I mentioned 5 different verses of the Bible, and I could have given about 25 or 30 more. And I didn't stop and say, okay, let's talk about the context of this verse and let's move on to the next. No, I was trying to establish the fact that there's multiple verses in the Bible that were used to justify people's belief that the God of the Old Testament was unjust. And if you study the Marcionites and early Marcionites and modern Marcionism and the people that reject the Old Testament, you'll see that this is still concise. We still see this transpiring today in the so-called book or Word of God. The so-called Bible is supposed to be the Word of God, and people reject the Word of God and say, we don't accept that anymore. We know that the Old Testament says not to consume the flesh of swine, but we don't care about that anymore. We're still going to eat a big old ham on Christmas morning. So no, I didn't avoid the context. I simply didn't have time to go through the context of 5 different verses in 5 minutes.
But if you're going to say that you believe when God is unjust, you should have went through the context to show why you believe that God is unjust. Shouldn't you have?
Yeah, and we eventually did.
When did you ever?
Were you here with us, Chris?
When did you actually give any of that context at all?
Okay, well, I talked about the Ark of the Covenant. I talked about the Ark of the Covenant. I talked about the bread.
The context
hold on. I talked about the bread. If you want to go in full detail about each of these verses, I have plenty of time to do that. I assure you. Please don't assume and try to accuse me of not knowing the context of what I'm talking about. And I absolutely do. I would not call to talk about this if I didn't know.
When did you give any context to any of the verses you supplied? When did you give any context to the verses you supplied?
I gave the context when I discussed what was transpiring with the Ark of the Covenant, the fact that it was being hauled. As a matter of fact, I read the verse directly. I gave the context of the verse. I explained what was transpiring. But that's neither here nor there, Chris.
No, Kenny. Did you give the context that God gave the command not to touch it or you would die? Did you give that context?
Maybe not.
Why not? You either didn't know that was the context, or you omitted it for a specific reason. So which one would it be?
That's not true. What we were trying to focus on is the context of is whether or not God is just or unjust. Okay, God said do not, we talked about this when we talked about God said do not touch this tree with Adam and Eve. Okay, so we applied the same context saying God said do not touch this Ark of the Covenant. So actually I did address this. Okay, I actually did address this. And I addressed it quite thoroughly. And my point was that God, knowing the intentions of our heart, knowing us better than we know ourselves, would he kill someone based on someone reaching out to prevent this Ark of the Covenant from falling, which would be deemed as a good act, right? So we did talk about.
Whoa! How is it deemed as a good act? Explain from the Bible the context on how that is a good act.
Well, I didn't say that it's a context from the Bible. What I'm saying is that hold on, don't put words in my mouth and don't deny me of the words that I want to say. Okay, so quite simply, I did not say that it was the context of the Bible. What I implore you to do, and as a Muslim I'm required to do, is use logic, okay? We have to use logic to say, okay, the verses of the Bible say that the oxen stumbled and the man reached out to prevent the thing from falling, right? That's what the context is saying. And based on that context, we have to say, okay, will this be Why would God? You have to naturally consider and say, why would God kill him for reaching out to prevent it from falling once the oxen stumbled? Right? Why would God do that? As a Muslim, I don't believe God would do that. I don't believe that he'd be unjust like that. I just simply don't. And you're welcome to you're welcome to believe it all you want, Chris.
So, in that whole story that you just give, did you state that the command was to not touch it or you would die?
We talked about it. Yes, I did mention that. I talked about it in the context of Adam and Eve when I mentioned that Adam and Eve were told to not touch this tree or you will surely die. So I made that point in the same context of the man touching the Ark of the Covenant. Yes,
but they did surely die.
I most certainly did. There's plain and simple.
So
again, that's why you're repeating the straw man. You're chasing something that
was fulfilled.
Huh?
The command and consequence was fulfilled in Adam and Eve. They did die.
Well, they eventually died.
The man did die.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. That's fine.
Right. So the consequence was out there. So you can't relate that, because if you're saying that God should have just forgiven him, well, that's not what he did to Adam and Eve. The consequence.
Well, let's consider this. Let's consider this. Let's put these two issues, these two subjects on the scale here.
I just want to put another.
Hold on. Let's put these.
You brought up another argument about Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 33 and 34.
Let's put it on the scale.
Context that king would not allow the Israelites through.
Let's put this on the scale based on these two incidents.
Actually, just hold on a second. Okay. How much time do we have, Eric?
Well, according to the clock, it only looks like 3 or 4 minutes. But I have to get up before we sign off today. I do want to say something.
Let's put these two incidents on the scale just briefly. It won't take me 15, 20 seconds. You take the most grave issue that ever faced mankind with Adam and Eve eating the fruit and sending all the rest of mankind into destruction based on what the Bible states, right? Okay, and then you equate that, and they were allowed to seek forgiveness. They actually did seek forgiveness, and it's there in Genesis, right? They actually sought forgiveness, and they received mercy from their Lord. And you take a man that didn't get the chance to seek forgiveness. Now, you put these on the scales, the most grave sin of all kind, the greatest sin of all kind, the original sin that has to far outweigh a man reaching out to save the ark from falling into its destruction. And put these on the scale and say, okay, well, God, in this situation, the most grave incident in the history of mankind with Adam and Eve, but he gave them the ability, the chance to seek forgiveness. But with this other man, he destroyed him instantly. He told them both the same thing: do not touch this tree, do not touch this Ark of the Covenant. In one instance, we see that God was forgiving and merciful, and gave him forgiveness, although they, in the Bible it's described that he had to, the man had to toil and the woman had to have pains in childbirth and all these things. But inevitably they were still forgiven for that. They weren't killed outright. But the man is laying at the foot of the Ark of the Covenant without even being given the opportunity to seek forgiveness, which is why the Marcionites and the people who reject the Old Testament today and more rely on the New Testament, they reject the Old Testament based on these very verses that we're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kenny. Go ahead, Eric. You can finish around the last minute or two.
Yeah, I wanted to address something that he had said, some things that I had said on my show a couple weeks ago. And I do a segment on my show called The Crier's Corner, and it's basically geared towards people who are always claiming this victimhood status, saying that everybody's out to get them. In Kenny's book, there's quite a bit of it going on here, but the one part that we were speaking about, or that he spoke about, was where he went to a fundraiser in a Christian church where people were going to raise money because he was involved in a motorcycle accident. And during the course of this service, it says that a guy got up on the stage and said the following words: "People who do not accept Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior are going to hell." Then he looked over at me and said, "I'm sorry, brother, but I got to speak the truth." Now, down here, he further says that he said that the man was condemning, or it certainly was an issue for the man that he felt the need to address the subject by sending me to hell. Now, that's not the same thing, and this is what I was pointing out, but the main thesis of this is I was saying the guy was an a-hole for doing this in this venue. You know, when you're having a fundraiser for somebody, you don't denigrate them in front of the entire crowd. You just don't do that. That's just stupid. And I was saying that there are Christians that are a-holes. I most certainly did say that. But then his thesis here was he was condemning him to hell, and that's not true. The guy wasn't condemning him to hell. It was just telling what the Bible said. If you die outside of Christ, without Christ, you're going to go to hell. The Bible clearly teaches that. Well, I turned around and made a juxtaposition on that about what the Quran says about condemning to hell. And Kenny said here several times today that God does not forgive those who associate partners with him, and that would be the Christians. This is where they say that we associate partners with God, which isn't true. Muhammad had no concept of what the Christian God or what the Trinity was. But with that said, in the Quran, it says that people who are going to hell are given these jackets or these clothes so they can burn in hell, where they're compounding the pain and punishment. And Kenny, I know he wants to go to the book of Revelation, to throw in the lake of fire, But this God is compounding the pain and suffering that people have in hell by having them burn their skin off and then having them regrow the skin. That is an a-hole. To do that to somebody, you are being an a-hole. And on top of that, I also cited Quran chapter 5, verse 33, where God prescribes the punishment for people of crucifixion. Crucifixion is the most cruel way that you could possibly kill somebody. That is a clear demonstration of man's inhumanity to mankind. But yet, the God of the Quran does this to mankind. So that was the point that I was making.
Okay, let me say something on that Eric, please, because I do want to say what it says in Revelation, and I just want to read just two short verses. That's convenient, Chris. That's convenient. But once again, he's made this claim against the Quran, but the Bible says the same thing. But the cowardly and the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral. Hold on, Chris. Let's be.
We're running out of time.
Right, I realize that. Those who practice bad arts, they're not
to have a discussion on the
listen. Once again, that's while you're talking, I could have already read the two verses that I wanted to read.
But I wouldn't have to talk.
While you're talking, I could have already read those verses.
To talk if we could just end it now, though.
Right, I know because that's convenient for you. Because you don't need to point out the umpteen verses. I've got at least 30 verses in the Bible right here in front of me. 30 verses of the Bible right here in front of me that describe the same type of things that Eric was criticizing. That's what I thought.
You can call in Eric's show any Tuesday night.
I know, but we could have dealt with this issue right here while you're rambling on like you always do. We could have dealt with this issue right here in just about 30. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Praise be to Allah, the cherisher and the sustainer of the world. As you see there at the end of the program, they were running from the point that I was trying to make about the Bible and what in its description of hell. Basically trying to point out their hypocrisy and their ridiculous criticizing, alhamdulillah, my mouth is dry, them criticizing the Quran for its description of hell. Actually, the descriptions of hell are actually a blessing to mankind because it's a warning to mankind. And alhamdulillah, there's similar things that are mentioned in their own Bible. And obviously these characters are so busy trying to attack Islam, attack the Quran, and to undermine the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and trying to discredit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator and their creator. And they're so busy doing that they're unfamiliar with their own verses. So I thank you for listening. Once again, my name is Kenny Bomer. I'm the author of the book Consider Islam. This is the podcast Consider Islam. Truth has been made clear from error. And I thank you for listening. I ask you to please, if you could, please donate any small amount to donate to my podcast. to help me in my dawah efforts to share the truth and the beauty of Islam with non-Muslims and to address issues in the Muslim community and talk about things that matter and things that we're all going through in this world. I do encourage you to go to my website, kennybomer.com, to check out the podcast and to follow my blog, and to also purchase the book if you would like. The book, Consider Islam Disproving the Patriots of Propaganda, which you can also get on Amazon. Just go to Amazon, look up Kenny Bomer, and it'll pop up. Also, the website, the very popular Muslim website, Dur al-Salam, you can find it there as well. And if you'd like to donate to my dawah efforts, I would certainly appreciate it, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for doing so. You can go to paypal.me/Kenny Bomer and make a donation if you'd like, or you can donate through the website itself. You can donate for charities, and just go to the website and you'll be able to see the places there that you can donate or purchase the book if you'd like. And I ask you to please do so, because this is very important to me. We're not promised tomorrow, so I'm trying to utilize the time that I do have left in this world to do something positive. And there's an authentic hadith which states that for a person to support the da'i financially or otherwise, you receive the reward of the da'i without the reward of the da'i being diminished in the least. So you still get rewards for your efforts. So everyone that this podcast reaches, or if you want to purchase the book to give to non-Muslims, all of your efforts are going to be waiting for you, and you're going to benefit from it in this world and on the Day of Judgment, inshallah. So I ask you to consider that, and to consider the beauty and the truth of Islam, and to encourage you to share Islam with other people anytime that you get a chance. So once again, thank you for listening to this podcast. I am the author, Kenny Bomer, author of Consider Islam Disproving the Patriots of Propaganda. I'm in the process of writing my second book, Everything is a Test. Truth has been made clear from error. Right now as we speak, I'm on the 7th chapter or so, and so be on the lookout for that. I thank you for listening. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, La ilaha illallah, wa shadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Praise be to Allah. I bear witness there's no God other than Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his final servant and the seal of our prophets. Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon everyone who's listening.